So for my experiment, I observed the effects of excess nutrients on algae growth. Some background information on this topic. Coastal ecosystems have been having environmental issues, and this can be traced back to excess nutrients in the water. And this causes the algae to grow a lot more than usual, and when that happens, they end up using up all the dissolved oxygen. So then other aquatic plants and animals end up dying from a lack of oxygen, and the algae also blocks sunlight on the surface. So then plants that are below the surface end up not being able to photosynthesize and stuff. And so they end up dying, and this whole process is called eutrophication. So what I did was I got 4 jars, and in one of them I just put plain distilled water, and then the other 3 I filled up with water from a nearby creek, and then in 2 of those I put phosphorus-rich fertilizer, and so one of them I put 1 scoop, and then in the other one I put 1.5 scoops of the fertilizer. And then I put these 4 jars on my balcony where they could get lots of sunlight, and I observed the algae growth for about 3 weeks. And then to measure the algae growth, I strained the water and then weighed the algae that was left behind after straining it. And this is a photo of basically what my experiment looked like, but I didn't take a picture of them all next to each other, but I found this one online, and it's pretty much what mine looked like, except it didn't have all this grass in it. So my hypothesis, the null hypothesis, is there will be no significant difference in algae growth between the jars. And the alternative hypothesis is adding phosphorus-rich fertilizer to a water sample from a creek will cause more algae growth than if the fertilizer was not added. And in this photo here, you can see a lake before and after eutrophication happened. So that's the algae bloom, and that's without the algae bloom. My results, so jar 1, which was the control, it just had plain distilled water in it. It had no algae growth, which was expected. And then jar 2, which had no fertilizer, but it did have the creek water. It did have some algae growth, but there was a lot more in the jars that did have the fertilizer. So the growth in the jar that didn't have the fertilizer was just kind of the average expected growth rate of the algae because there was no extra nutrients in the water. This is my graph showing the jars that did have fertilizer and the jars that didn't have fertilizer, and you can see the ones that did, the weight of the algae that grew was much higher than, or significantly higher than the ones that did not have fertilizer. So my discussion, so again, algae blooms occur when there's an overpopulation of algae due to excessive nutrients in the water. And the reason I used phosphorus-rich fertilizer is because phosphorus and nitrogen are 2 crucial ingredients for life, and they're often the limiting factors for plant growth. So when there's high levels of phosphorus or nitrogen, or both, in the water, there's nothing that's stopping the algae from just continuing to grow. So if there's extra in the water, they'll just keep using it and keep growing. And causes of eutrophication are often caused by humans, from things like agricultural runoff, leaking septic systems, waste from sewage treatment plants, and things like that. And again, this is harmful to the rest of the aquatic life. In this photo here, you can see a fish washed up in this green water, so that's probably died from a lack of oxygen because all this green algae in the water is using it up. And from my experiment, I could see that fertilizer did have a significant impact on the algae growth. Again, you can see that in this graph. And if I were to repeat this experiment, I would probably use larger water samples, just so it'd be easier to, just by looking at the jars, it'd be easier to see the difference in algae growth rates. I think it would be easier to see if my water sample was larger. And I would also add other plants to the jars to see how they reacted to the algae growing faster, because maybe if in the jar with the most fertilizer in it, the plant would survive, or maybe not. So I'd probably do that. And these are my references. And yeah, that's all.